Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where today going to jump back into US politics and have a look at the Senate, because for a while, and certainly in my last update, I believed that the Democrats basically had no pathway to Senate control, but there has been some recent developments, and whether or not they end up playing out, at least it does appear that the Democrats have some sort of viable pathway to at least challenging for Senate control and potentially spreading Republicans a little bit thinner in terms of seats that they're defending than was once originally thought. So, to begin with, the midterms are generally characterized by the party who is out of power presidentially traditionally making gains, and I think the last time that didn't happen was in 2002, which was during George Bush Jr.'s first term, but soon after 9/11, and so the rally around the flag effect probably had some influence there. And I think it also happened the previous midterm cycle in 98 when Bill Clinton was impeached, but was still quite popular. So in terms of some of the developments, so we have this redistricting war where Republicans have earmarked Texas, in particular, but also states like Ohio and potentially Missouri and some other Republican-controlled states for redistricting in order for them to help buffer their slim majority in the House of Representatives. I think their majority is currently only effectively about 5 seats, give or take. So not many flips required for the Democrats to regain control of the House. However, if the Republicans can redraw the map in such a way that they're defending more like 10, 15, even 20 seats, that would make it much more difficult for the Democrats to win back control of the House, obviously. In response, the Democrats, particularly Gavin Newsom in California, has said that they're going to try and redraw their map, but they have a slightly different process, and it's not looking quite so certain that they might actually be able to do that, owing to the fact that they have an independent or so-called independent commission, which I think he would have to win like a special referendum in order to dismantle that independent commission, something like that. Anyway, it's going to be a bit tricky for him to do that, but I have seen it said that in a full-on like gerrymandering war, the Republicans would stand to gain more than the Democrats. So it'd be interesting to see how that all plays out. In terms of the national scene or what's happening at the national level, the Democratic Party, their approval rating is as low as it's been in a long time. The Republicans are a little bit higher. And Trump himself as president is, depending on which poll you read, is generally sort of at a mid-single digit net disapproval. So he's a little bit underwater, but not to the extent that he was at around this time in his first term, and not to the extent that Biden was either. Interestingly, Gallup's party affiliation poll has actually seen the Democrats inch ahead for the first time since late 2023. However, if you have a look at voter registration data and in some of the update dumps that are tracked state by state, most of the states the Republicans are making gains, but that could have something to do with just updated registration of ancestral Democrat voters, particularly in states in the Midwest and even in parts of the South like Kentucky and Tennessee, where some of these voters might have been voting Republican for quite a while, like since 2016 perhaps, but it's only now that they're actually updating their voter registration. So here's the game. If we look at the map here, Democrats effectively need to gain, I think, 4 seats in order for them to take back control of the Senate, but their map doesn't look anywhere near as good as it does for the Republicans. So in order for them to win 51 seats, some of the flips look really challenging, and even some of their the seats that they're defending actually look quite competitive too. So we'll draw it out on this map. Firstly, the Democrats would need to hang on to seats like Michigan, New Hampshire, Georgia. And then that gets them to 47. So that's sort of where they are now. And these are all the seats that I'm thinking might be either in play or slightly in play. Obviously, the trends in the larger states like Florida and Texas have been, really quite strong for the Republicans in recent cycles. And you could probably add Iowa to that list as well. Kansas is one that's been trending to the Democrats, but I haven't heard a great deal of noise about that particular race. And then in Nebraska, we'll get to some of these individual seats later, but you could make a case that Dan Osborne, in an off-presidential year, could, if he's going to make another run, having run pretty well, like well ahead of Kamala Harris as an independent in 2024, he could stand to do a little bit better next time. But I'm going to fill that in Republican for the moment. So that's the pathway for Democrats. They need to flip North Carolina, Maine, Ohio, and then Alaska. That, I think, is the most viable pathway for Democrats to get to 51 seats. Now, it should be noted that with midterm elections, they generally, or in fact always, I think, tend to attract lower turnout than presidential years. And since the fall of the New Deal coalition, which saw the Democrats pretty much have a stranglehold on both the House and the Senate for decades, the midterm cycles generally have favored Republicans because lower turnout generally meant the more affluent and college-educated voters were more likely to turn out than your sort of lower propensity voters, maybe your like African-American, Latino voters, young voters, those typical Democrat voting blocks. They wouldn't turn out in as high rates as your more kind of like suburban, wealthier, college-educated voters. And for most of the 1990s and the 2010s, that meant that Republicans benefited. And particularly in years such as 2002, 2010, 2014, that really played into their hands. However, during the Trump era, that seems to have flipped because the realignment of American politics that happened under Trump is such that some of those lower propensity groups, particularly working class families, blue collar workers, even Latino men, young African American men, younger voters in general, that sort of Gen Z block, a lot of them, particularly in 2024, moved quite a way to the GOP and away from Democrats. But at the same time, these suburban, college-educated white voters in particular are moving towards the Democrats, and they are the group that are generally more likely to turn out in these midterm elections. So in 2018, we saw this big blue wave where the Democrats made major gains, particularly in the House. And then in 2022, young voters in particular came out and the Republicans weren't able to get the Trump base out to the extent that they needed to, and they failed to flip several key Senate races. And in fact, they weren't able to defend the open seat in Pennsylvania. And their gains in the House were, pretty minimal. I think they only won 9 seats or something like that. So they have this problem of countering low turnout, the Republicans now, and it's sort of been reflected in the way the parties run their campaigns. Democrats used to be looking to drive turnout. Those kind of get out to vote campaigns, they're not as common now. Whereas Republicans, particularly in 2020, were very much caught flat on their feet in terms of making use of mail-in voting and encouraging people to get out and vote, whereas Democrats did it really well. In 2024, the Republicans really stepped up that sort of on-the-ground campaign to get people registered, and they realized that the more people who came out and voted, perhaps the more it was to their advantage, certainly in those kind of lower propensity groups. And then also on the national scene, Democrats seem to be facing the money problem, and I would say, unlike the Republicans, where the populist wing of the party basically has taken over almost full control under Trump. The Democrats are very much at war with each other still, where you have the more kind of cashed up and the more influential, I guess, establishment wing of the party, which is really struggling to connect with voters. But the anti-establishment wing of the party, the more sort of progressive and socialist wing of the party, it probably has more appeal to younger voters in particular. But that war hasn't been settled, and I think there's a lot of internal division there, and some of your bigger donors and your more kind of regular, like college educated, more affluent voters are probably a little bit put off by that wing of the party. But obviously Democrats just have this issue with can they sort of find that delicate balance between the establishment and the populist wing of their party, and how's that going to play out in the primaries? How's that going to play out in the general? A lot of that needs to play out, but for now we just note that they're not exactly a united party the same way they might have been in previous cycles. So I'll go through state by state now. The seat of Maine, which is currently held by the GOP's Susan Collins, she is a particularly sort of moderate Republican. I think she voted against the Big Beautiful Bill, and she's voted with Democrats quite a lot. Maine is the sort of state where the polarization in American politics hasn't affected them quite so much. The other Senate seat is actually held by an independent who caucuses with the Democrats, and Susan Collins has overcome unfavorable national environments and poor personal ratings before, and unexpectedly won by reasonably large margins. 2020 was a good example where she outran Trump by 18 points or something. So it's going to be a challenging one to flip, but with Collins still on the ticket, it's going to be an interesting one for Democrats to go for. For the moment, I think the Republicans probably have the edge. So I'll fill that in light red. Then we go to New Hampshire, which is an open seat now with Jeanne. I don't know how to say it. Jeanne Sheehan. She is retiring. She's the incumbent. Not a particularly well-liked incumbent from what I understand. Republicans couldn't get Chris Sununu to run, who was their very popular governor, recently became term limited, but they have recruited ex-Massachusetts Senator Scott Brown, who's a known moderate. I think for the moment, though, with the national politics the way they are, I think the Democrats are probably fairly likely to hold that seat. But we'll see what happens to the polls, and we'll see if the Democrat Party continues to flounder in terms of its approvals. Then Ohio. So this is an interesting one. Obviously, a very, very Trump state. It was a state that voted twice for Obama. It was a key swing state back in the Bush era. But since then, Trump's very much made it a safe Republican state. However, in terms of the Senate seats, it's not quite so clear-cut. So J.D. Vance won in 2022, 6 or 7 points, I think the margin was. And then the Senate race was back in 2024 was quite a bit closer than the presidential race there. I think Bernie Moreno ended up knocking off Sherrod Brown by about 5 points, and it was the most expensive Senate campaign in history, I believe. So Sherrod Brown has decided he's going to run again as the Democrat nominee. It's going to be an interesting one to watch. It probably puts the Republicans on notice. It probably means they're going to have to spend quite a bit more there than they otherwise would have liked to. But Sherrod Brown himself, I think, from what I understand, he was more known as, he had a bit more appeal to those blue-collar workers, that the kind of voters that used to just vote Democrat down the ticket, but that Trump has managed to woo over. Those kinds of voters are maybe the ones that aren't as likely to turn out in a midterm. So I'm not entirely sure that he has this massive advantage with turnout dynamics the way they are in midterms. But at the same time, he's a long-time senator, and he was only narrowly defeated in a state where, obviously at the presidential level, it went pretty heavily towards Trump. So I still think Republicans very much have the edge there, but they are going to have to invest more in that state than they would have liked. So but then we go further north to Michigan, very competitive open seat. Trump narrowly carried it in 2024, but wasn't able to drag the GOP's Mike Rogers over the line against Alyssa Slotkin. She got over the line by 0.3% in that Senate seat in 2024. Now, Mike Rogers looks like he's going to run again. Not an especially strong candidate, but obviously has that name recognition now, and ran a pretty solid campaign. The Democrats look like they're going to be in for a pretty competitive primary, and the presence of Abdul El Sayed is going to be interesting too. If he doesn't make it through the primary, the Democrats might face some issues in places like Ann Arbor, where you've got that higher kind of Arab population, and you've got younger voters who are very much energized over the issue of Gaza and Israel. So there could be some kind of internal issues on the Democrat side that develop over the course of this campaign. For now, though, given the national environment, I would have to say the Democrats are slightly in front there. So then we go down to Kentucky. Just watch the primary here. It's sort of a battle between Trump and McConnell, like a proxy war between the two. I think Trump is probably going to get... It's a matter of like who Trump endorses. They'll probably get the nomination. But again, just one to watch the primary. I don't think the general's going to be competitive at all. So then down to North Carolina, probably the most competitive seat on this map. The Democrats have drafted in popular former Governor Roy Cooper, who I think at last check had about 51% approval rating. And he'll be running for Tom Tillis's open seat. Tom Tillis was a more moderate tending Republican who I think found himself increasingly at odds with the Trump agenda. Not a massively popular candidate. He never, in both times he ran, he won the seat, but he didn't get over 50% of the vote. North Carolina as well, very close state. Harris lost it by about 3% at the presidential level, So Trump carried the state in 2020 and then again in 2024, but the swing was only about sort of 1.5% between those years, even though the national swing to him was more like 6%. So it is a state that's arguably trending towards the Democrats, and there's a lot of population growth in the Research Triangle area around Raleigh-Durham, and it's that sort of demographic that tends to be shifting towards the Democrats, and those are the kinds of people that are going to turn out in a midterm cycle. I think the Democrats have the slight edge here currently. Down to Georgia, so this is probably the most competitive Democrat-held seat. John Ossoff is defending the seat that he won in the runoff in 2020, which coincided with Biden's very slim presidential win in the state. The Republicans weren't able to get Brian Kemp to run. Trump did carry the state by over 2% presidentially in 2024. Again, it's similar to North Carolina, where big population growth in the Atlanta metropolitan area is definitely shifting the state more and more towards Democrats. And the one thing I should note, though, is that turnout dynamics can sometimes favor Republicans in midterms, mostly because of the African American turnout and that also probably applies to North Carolina to some extent as well. So at this stage, I also have this tilt Democrat, but it's going to be an extremely competitive race. I just think the overall trend towards the Democrats in this seat and the national environment probably lead to them holding it. Florida, I think, will be fine for the Republicans. In Texas, Colin Allred is running again after a pretty heavy loss to Ted Cruz in 2024, who rode in comfortably on Trump's coattails. The key thing to watch here is going to be the Republican primary. It's an open seat, and if Ken Paxton becomes the GOP nominee, he's quite polarizing and controversial. The Democrats could be an outside chance if he wins the nomination, but otherwise I think the Republicans should be able to defend that seat. Up in Iowa, the incumbent GOP guy is a little bit gaffe prone. Whether or not that's enough for Democrats to win, this fairly rural and very Trumpian type state, I don't think it is, but it could be another one where Democrats force Republicans to spend some of their resources defending it, but for now I think Republicans hold. Nebraska, I mentioned earlier, Dan Osborne is, I think, either considering running or he's confirmed to run. The one thing that's different from the 2024 cycle where he did quite well is that the incumbent is a stronger candidate than the one who was defending the seat in 2024 for the Republicans. So I think, again, they defend that one fairly comfortably. Kansas, it's a rural seat that is trending towards the Democrats, but not to the point where I think it's competitive. And then Alaska, the key here is whether or not Mary Peltola runs. She was the Democrat who was able to win the House seat, the congressional House seat in 2022, which was the first time that a Democrat had won it for quite a while, if not ever, I think. Probably not ever, probably just for a while. Very popular candidate. However, the governor's race is also one where she would be heavily considering running for it. I think the Senate seat would be a real challenge for her to overcome the current margin, but the governor's race is one that would absolutely be a little bit more competitive for her. But Chuck Schumer is trying to convince her to run for the Senate seat to give the Democrats a viable pathway to 51. Remembering, of course, that 50-50 would still be Republican control because of J.D. Vance's tiebreaker vote. So for the moment, Alaska I have as a fairly comfortable or fairly solid seat for the Republicans, and if Peltola doesn't run, it probably becomes a safe Republican seat. All right, so there we have it. Democrats do have some sort of pathway to 51 if everything goes right, and perhaps if the national environment declines a little bit more for the GOP under Trump. But at this stage, it does look as if, while some races are going to be a bit closer than first thought, I still think the Republicans are in the best position to maintain their majority in the Senate. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be covering a little bit more of US politics as 2025 draws to an end. We have a couple of governor's races and, of course, the New York City mayoral race, which will be really interesting to see if the Democrats win with Mandami as their candidate. And then, of course, going into 2026. That's going to be a big year for the channel, actually, with quite a few important elections, particularly towards the end of 2026. But I'll be covering the House races and the Senate races in a little bit more detail. Okay, thanks for watching. Please comment your thoughts, particularly if you live in the States and you've got a good tip for me. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content. You'd like to see more. But most importantly of all, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.